Okay, we're back in Pro Tools. This is the sample song When You Rain, and we're starting off with the kick drum. We just have a single kick drum track right here, and look at this EQ. It's starting to look pretty familiar, right? We have our fundamental that we're going through around 70 Hertz in this place, scooping out some of the boxiness. That might be just a little wider, I would say. And then we have the snap of the kick drum. Let's have a listen. Might be a little heavy on the low end. Okay, so let's bypass that and have a listen. So it's flat. And then we'll drop it in. Much punchier, right? So I think I've said this a few other times. The boosting of the low end is good, but you can bring up the perceived loudness of a kick drum by adding a little slap or snap around 2K, something like that. And if it's a little different on your system, then just slide that frequency around until that pops right out. In this mix, it was around 2.4, and it is right there. So in this track, we just have a single snare track, just one microphone on the top of the snare, and it starts off with a flam. And that's working against the kick if we solo this as well. And then when the hi-hats come in, it's just a single snare drum hit, and then you can see down here that we're going to go into side stick. So in terms of this snare drum being these side sticks being able to kind of poke their head through the mix, that is a job with compression. In fact, in the compression masterclass in compression limiters and gates, we go over an example of how to really get a side stick to sit in a mix without popping these snare drum hits, right out into distortion. Anyway, but we're talking about EQ right now, so let's go to the top of this part of the track here, and you can see what I've done here. First things first, I've done a high pass filter. I could probably afford to make that a little steeper, and then the first thing I'll go after is I call it tubbiness, or the body of a snare, and that's typically around 200 Hertz. So let's have a listen to what that sounds like. Hear how that's kind of the low end of that snare drum? If we were to pull it out, it would sound very, very thin. So there's a little boost there. Then around 1K, have a bit of a snap right there, and then we have a sheen on top, and maybe that might be a little bit more like 6K. So this is what this sounds like. Let me go back to the top here, and we'll listen to that bypassed. It's flat, and then with our EQ. Let's hear that with the kick drum. Great, our mix is starting to take shape. Spend a lot of time on your kick and snare in terms of your drums. Okay, so in terms of hi-hats, here's where they start. And in fact, there's no hi-hats right here. This is all bleed coming from a snare drum. Okay, so that's really where the snare drum, where the hi-hat starts. So there's a couple of things you could do on a DAW, is just cut this area over here, just cut it completely out. You could also use a noise gate, but because snare drums and hi-hats very close together. Sometimes it's a little difficult to use that. But there are a couple of things that you could do with this track. Now, what do you think I would have done in terms of EQ of this? Can you imagine what the curve looks like before I bring it up? There you go. We have a pretty steep high-pass filter, lopping off everything from, what is that, probably about 200. And then we go across here. There's a little kind of a clunk area in a hi-hat. Let me just play it from here, and we'll boost this area here around 1K. Here's the hi-hat. Pretty nasty right around there, right? So just pulling a little bit out of there will just help that sit in the mix a little bit better. And then we have some shine over the top around 7K, and that is a bell shape. You might even want to make that. Yeah, let me see. So let's bypass that. That'll sit well. Let's listen to all of them. Well, now he's mainly playing on the ride, and he's also pedaling the hi-hat. Let's go back to here where the hi-hat was mainly. Great, our drum mix is starting to take shape. Okay, now we have 4 tom tracks, tom 1, 2, 3, and 4. And what you'll notice if you're looking at the waveforms of this is a lot of bleed. None of this is actually tom 1. This is the only time in this whole track when tom 1 is actually being played, and the rest of the time this mic is bringing up bleed from all the other microphones as well. So how would you fix that? In a DAW, I would grab all of this and then just delete it out and just be left with just these fills. Now you can't do that in a live situation, and so what you would do is use a noise gate. And I'm not going to get into noise gates here. If you really want to know what noise gates are all about, go into the masterclass with compression limiters and gates, and you'll see we do a lot of work with that. The big benefit is that you can get rid of all of this stuff automatically. In a DAW, you can do it, manually, like I said, by cutting things out. But certainly in a live situation, you will need to use a noise gate. And basically, you set up the threshold, so only these peaks here will cut through. All the rest of here will be drowned. Will actually be the gain reduced so much that they'll basically not even be there. And the reasons why you might want to do that, if you have all of these open, you've got tom 1, tom 2, tom 3, tom 4, all of them open, then guess what? What happens is that all of this low-level stuff comes through, and it all arrives at, this is probably a snare and hat that is bleeding through, or maybe even a kick drum. If they are arriving at these microphones at different times because they're all different distances away from each other, then you can have some of that phase cancellation, just like we heard with that snare drum that was mic'd from the top and the bottom. We had to flip the phase of the bottom mic'd, and you could hear how much of the low end of that snare drum was just getting robbed because of all of this stuff. Anyway, so that's the reason behind why you'd want to use a gate, or if you're in a DAW, why you want to just select these and delete them basically. But here's what's going on in terms of the toms. I don't really spend a lot of time working on toms unless it's a really, it's kind of an anthem song that there's a lot of toms in. But in a lot of songs, I mean, this is, once every 16 measures, there'll be like one hit on here. So one thing I will go after is the stick sound, which is normally around 2K. Let me just loop this area here. Hear how that's exactly where the sticks are kind of like sitting right there around 2K. I would go for that. I'd also roll things off, and once you have set that up for tom number 1, and what I would typically do is just copy that and then just go over to tom number 2, and I would paste that. But you'll notice, let me just I've lost that. Oh, I've totally messed it up now. Let me go back to the first one here, and we want to copy that and go down here, and we want to paste that. The only thing I would do as I go down these toms, tom 1's normally the smallest one, maybe an 8 or a 10 inch, and then they just keep on getting into, this might be a really large floor tom, that all I would do is I would just change this frequency point and then just extend it down a little bit further. You can imagine every tom you get down further. In fact, I'm actually changing on tom number 2 right here. So I would select here tom number 4, and I would bring that down even further. Well, in fact, you've seen this. This is the kind of changes I made. So if tom 3 and 4, you can see that the high pass filter just rolls off the lows at a lower pace, because with each tom getting larger, those fundamentals will be naturally lower. Okay, onto our ride. You can see that there's spikes all over this ride track, but most of the time, if we're soloing this track, it's not the ride we're picking up. That's hat, right? Hat and snare is coming through this, and then right about now, we should hear ride. Okay, so that's really where the ride is coming in there. Again, you can delete this part, you can gate this part if you're if you're doing this live. And let's see what the EQ bands look like. Again, we're rolling off. Maybe make that a little, rather than the point there, let's make it steeper with our 18 dB per octave. And we're just adding a little bit around 3K. Let's listen. It's where that kind of stick is hitting the cymbal there, and then also some sheen above that. Okay, so let's move on to the overheads, which are pretty similar. Overhead. Okay, so this is a stereo track right here. And so we have a stereo EQ right here. Okay, so again, we're rolling off the low end around 110 Hertz. I might even make that a little steeper. And we're just adding a little sheen up here, and also the stick sound. Whoops, okay, here we go. So there's lots of things coming on there, but if we were to solo all of the drums, it'd start to come to life. Great, we've got a pretty good mix going along here with our drums. We've EQ'd them all. Let's move on to bass.